Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We are here to talk about artificial intelligence and whether your trust needs it, and then how to get it right first time. So this is a Qure.ai sponsored workshop, and we have 4 excellent speakers who will be talking about that topic today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Emma Hughes, and I'm the evaluation lead for the AI in Health and Care Award. That award has been supporting a number of the people and projects that you've heard about over the last couple of days. So it's really nice to see the impact that the funding has been having. Just to give a bit of context for the discussion, we'll be focusing on the use case of AI for diagnostic imaging this morning, as that's one of the most mature use cases for AI. I don't think I need to tell this audience, but we all know that AI has great promise to alleviate the demands on our workforce. I think a recent estimation estimates that radiologists have to read an image every 3 to 4 seconds in order to meet the demands of an 8-hour workday. So we know that there's a really high demand and pressure on our radiology workforce at the moment, which AI has the potential to help alleviate. We also know that AI has the potential to reduce inter and intra-reader variation, helping us to spot more diseases earlier, spotting things like cancer earlier, as well as supporting clinicians with their decision-making and supporting them to have more confidence in the decisions that they've made around their patient management. I guess the questions that we will be discussing this morning are really threefold. We know that AI holds great promise, so how do we make sure that promise is realized in the real world? And we'll be talking about 3 questions, as I've said. So the first question of how do you decide which AI technologies meet your clinical problem? How do you go about assessing the technologies that are out there and deciding which ones to bring into your trust? Then secondly, once you've made the decision as to what you want to implement, how do you go about implementing and getting it right first time? And then thirdly, how do you evaluate the implementation that you did? How do you make sure that the AI that you implemented is actually leading to the outcomes that you wanted to see? So how do you do that ongoing evaluation piece? So without further ado, I will introduce our 4 excellent speakers this morning. We have Mathew, who is Senior Program Manager at the NHS AI Lab in the AI imaging team. And he's a graduate of the NHS Digital Academy and has degrees in artificial intelligence, public administration, and information systems, so all very, very relevant aspects. We also have Garry Pettet, who is a consultant radiologist with an extensive background in software engineering, and he now works for Medica, contributing to their future technology plans, and has a special interest in pediatrics and neuroradiology. Then we also have Amrita Kumar, who is a consultant radiologist and AI clinical lead at Frimley Health NHS Foundation Trust. And she's led a trust-wide research collaborative to implement digital-enabled AI infrastructure. And then finally, lastly, but very not least, we have Dr. Hugh Harvey, who serves as the Managing Director at Hardian Health. And he is an experienced clinician and health technology consultant. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Mathew. And yeah, I will let you come up and do your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here face-to-face. This is only my second face-to-face event in 2 years, so I'm still getting used to seeing so many people in a tight space. So I'm assuming you've all seen or heard of the Hitchhiker's Guide, the famous phrase, don't panic. And we're here today to talk about how can AI help solve healthcare delivery challenges. Don't panic. So I'm Mathew Watt, Senior Program Manager for the NHS AI Lab, here standing in for Dominic Cushnan. So before we start, AI as a tool. So today's workshop theme is, does your healthcare service need it, AI? It's a great quote by Rodney Brooks. He invented the Roomba, a lovely little vacuum, and he was also a professor at MIT, very much a prominent roboticist. But he said, look, AI is a tool, not a threat. So I looked into, well, what is a tool? And a tool is something that can help or hinder accomplishing a task. So I guess when it comes down to, does AI help or hinder what you're trying to do? Could it help or hinder? That's what we're trying to understand here. So the NHS AI Lab, who are we and what are we doing? So like all programs, we're structured in a number of different work streams. We've got regulation, we've got ethics, we've got some looking at imaging, skunk works, and I'll tell you a bit more about these. There's a whole bunch of activities going on around strategy and policy, working with all the different regulation bodies, with the different government departments. Also looking at how do we engage with people, so people, clinicians, anybody who may have an interest in AI. What is it that they need to know? What do we need to know from them? And some of our goals around how can we demonstrate the potential of AI? How do we know it works? Builds onto how do we then build trust and confidence? If something works, you tend to likely have more trust and confidence. But just because you have trust and confidence doesn't necessarily mean that it works. So how do we understand what these issues are? It's a bit circular. And how can we get a better understanding of what the regulatory issues are with relation to AI? How can we form these conversations? How can we help them? So there's an audience participation warning here. So this is an AI lifecycle from the Information Commissioner's Office. It's like most standard product life cycles, You build something, you release it, you have business cases, etc. But AI is not the same as non-AI technology. Just wonder if anybody can tell me why. Hugh, you've got your hand up.
There are definitely similarities with other software-based things, but the thing that makes AI different is the potential for very rapid improvement cycles.
Thank you. So Hugh said there's the potential for rapid cycles. Rapid improvement cycles, sorry. Anyone else got any views on why AI is different? And please do speak into the microphone for the camera purposes. Any other views? The regulatory landscape is different for AI versus other technologies. Okay.
Decision support
Okay. Okay.
It's not straightforward to scrutinize how a deep learning network actually works.
Okay, it's not straightforward to scrutinize how a deep learning network works. And also, the actual nature of it's different. It's trained, it's not hard-coded. It's in some extent living, and it's not exactly living, but it's growing. Sorry, lady in the back, one more.
It's not clearly defined like most other technologies. A lot of people have different opinions of what artificial intelligence actually is.
It's not clearly defined, absolutely. There's all these things and many more. I guess the key thing is that there's no magic bullet here. There's no one size fits all. And when you're looking at the AI life cycle, there are so many different elements and things to consider. And some of them are straightforward, some are not. There's a lot of complexity here. So what I want to do is tell you about 4 areas that the NHS AI Lab have been working in terms of how can we help solve healthcare delivery challenges. So we've been developing and deploying AI. National COVID chest imaging database. Dominic Cushnan isn't here, but he's the lead for this. All the stuff we access via GitHub. In essence, when COVID hit, there was an idea to collect data, COVID chest images. Can we find some kind of mechanism that people could access data and train algorithms? So that's what we did. So there's roughly 65,000 images at present. This will be tripled very shortly. And the whole process followed the table on the bottom. So these are things we need to consider in terms of AI algorithms. We had to find a way to collect data. AI is data-driven. So we had to find a way to de-identify that data and store it. We also had to find a way to access that data. So how can AI developers access it in a way that is safe, that guards their intellectual property, that basically makes it in an accessible and easy-to-use format? Validation. Now, this is really interesting. We ran an independent validation exercise, which is basically a way to test, does the technology do what it says on the tin? And we did this for 5 different organizations. Now, I can't tell you the results, but what we did find was that we learned a lot about the process. We learned a lot about the technology that's required. We also learned a lot about why it's important to validate algorithms and what it means to validate algorithms. Now, this is all bundled into a trusted research environment. So NHS England are currently working on 2 initiatives around data pipelines. So this was just specifically for COVID chest, but they're now looking to expand it to other modalities. And also looking at a secure data environment or trusted research environment. How do you access this data in a safe and secure way? And then finally, how do you deploy these algorithms? Now, we didn't look into this, but this is something we're going to be looking into this year. How do you take these algorithms and deploy them? Now, there's lots of different examples, lots of different technologies, but how do you make sure this is repeatable, scalable? It's not just a one-off in a certain area. How do you make sure that this can be repeated in a cost-effective way? AI ethics. So Brummy is leading in this. So we're working with the Health Foundation, Ada Lovelace Institute, Health Education England. This is all about how do you build trust and confidence? How do we upskill the workforce? How do you look at regulation? Now, 2 things to note of interest here. One, there was a report published with Health Education England, I think about 3 weeks ago, around trust and confidence. So what are the issues and things that we need to understand in terms of AI and trust? The other one is the algorithm impact assessment with Ada Lovelace. So this is a tool or a mechanism to ask yourself questions of your process, of your tool, of the environment that you're in. Is what we're doing ethical? Will the tool be ethical when it's in use? Standing together. So this is a really interesting thing with University Hospitals Birmingham. They're looking at standards. So what's the minimum data set? What's the minimum level of information data that's needed with relation to demographics? What we don't want to do is have encourage or stimulate or inadvertently have biases in algorithm development. So how do you make sure that all the things that are needed are within there? So this is a really interesting project. So AI Health and Care Awards, Daniel Bamford. So this is working with the Academic Health Science Networks, the NIHR. And what they're trying to do is demonstrate the potential of algorithms and different AI technologies. Can we look at innovation routes? How do we open these? What are the barriers to innovation? How do we unblock these? Now, there's been a couple of rounds so far, and some guidance has been published. And roughly 140 million has been spent in the last 4 years. Roughly 79 projects across 60 different hospitals. You can roughly see where a map is that's quite south-centric. One of these is Brainomics. So this is around acute stroke brain scans. It's around augmenting or enhancing clinical decisions. It also helps with the sharing of data between hospitals. It's currently being trialled in 5 networks. Now, we don't have the results of this at the moment, but this is underway. So this is some of the work that they're doing. And finally, Skunkworks. So this is around understanding what are the infrastructure challenges, what are the system challenges that we have here. How can we demonstrate the potential of AI? How can we promote that AI has a needs-based approach and it's not just a funky tool that we can put in? What's the actual need for it? How can we upskill the workforce? So the team have delivered 5 proof of concepts, been working with a whole bunch of different partners, accelerated capability environments, Foundry, etc. And they've got a SWAT team. So what they've been doing is working with people to take proof of concepts and see, well, how do you take this from an idea into something that works? One of the things they've been looking at is called the data lens. Now, this is really fascinating. It's around taking a number of different databases and, in essence, seeing how can they combine these in a way that's useful. How can they break down language barriers? How can the data be accessed across all these different mechanisms in a way that actually generates useful insight, that actually informs decision-making, rather than spending time looking about these things? Basically, this is around burden reduction. So if we just think back to the AI lifecycle, what we've been trying to do in the AI lab is work with a whole bunch of people to understand what are the different things that could or should or need to be done. You know, we haven't bottomed these all out and we can't do it on our own. We're working with a lot of different people and there's a lot of people doing these things. So if you would like to find out more, come and speak to us in the virtual hub, email, phone, you can see the website. It's transitioning from NHSX to NHS England. So some of the content is not quite accessible. And do follow us on Twitter. And please do access our GitHub for the COVID chest imaging database. You can access all the code. Everything is there, and it's free to use. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mathew. So we will run the presentations one after the other, and then we'll save questions for the end. So we should have around 15 minutes for Q&A and discussion at the end. So I'd now like to, I believe, invite Amrita Kumar to come up and do her presentation. And the title is, How Do I Choose the Right Solution for My Clinical Problem? So excited
Thank
to
you
hear
very
about that.
much, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Amrita Kumar. I'm a consultant radiologist and AI clinical lead at Frimley. Just before I start off, can I just get a quick show of hands? How many clinicians are here? Oh, excellent. Lovely. So I've tried to keep this focus to address whether you're in academia, whether you're a clinician in a teaching hospital, or whether you're setting strategy at a more macro level. But when you look at how do I choose the right solution for my clinical problem, you're really coming down to ground level now. In an NHS Trust is where all this tech, all the strategy will come into play, and knowing how we take it forward here is a very important part where the focus is now shifting. Thank you so much. So just before thinking about how we start to decide to integrate or implement any sort of AI technology, I always stop and think about, well, actually, before we get into any sort of AI technology, as opposed to being approached by more proactive companies, actually taking a step back within the hospital trust, within the department, and thinking, why you need to use this. I was moderating a session yesterday where Professor Sally Collins said that she gets quite frustrated every time a new ultrasound machine comes out and she starts getting told about how amazing it is, when in reality, the actual core thing of using the ultrasound machine for her work hasn't changed. So it's very important to actually take a step back and say, well, why do you need to use this AI technology? What is your use case? So if you're looking at a specific problem, and I am a radiologist, imaging is where I'll always go back to. It helps that there's already structured data stored digitally in all hospital units, which is why over 50% of the CE marked AI companies currently in use are focused towards imaging in some form. But focusing on the problem as a clinician is where to start. So in my own journey, which started about 4 years ago, I actually wandered into the AI space because we were trying to address an issue we had come up in breast screening when it came to workforce planning, because people had retired earlier than expected. So finding out where you need to use this particular type of technology is the first step, to focus on a problem that you and your department want to solve, and where AI, therefore, which is a tool, can make a difference. But as a clinician, that's the number one step. And actually from here, everything else comes into play in terms of how you go about implementing it and how you go about picking what sort of technology. And it's very important to address that different NHS trusts are different in terms of they can be more academic, they can have more academic resources where you can actually think about following a more industry-led example where actually we will invest in AI in our own hospitals, where we have data scientists to come in and start using our own sort of data sitting in the PACS or within the EPR systems, and building out some sort of structure and actionable insight from there. Or you could be an NHS trust like us, which is more of a teaching hospital, that we do not have the resources right now to pull in academia where we are, but we can still use the resources because we are clinicians, we are domain experts, we have the data sitting right there, and we are getting the computational power delivered to us from other partners. That hybrid approach of having already established vendors with regulated, CE-approved or FDA-marked, well, CE-approved for us, products that can come in to help us with our bottleneck problems. So in a trust like us, we decided to focus, after discussion with our chief of service, what's a bottleneck for us? For us, let's look at chest x-rays, because CQC want us to deliver a certain metric, and we need to see how we can alleviate sort of the backlog when it comes to a chest x-ray reporting. Then we move on to how we start making the changes. So once we have an idea of the problem we want to solve, it's important to assemble the right team. And this team is not a small group of people doing a project in the imaging department. To really implement this, it has to be a system-wide change. And this is where we've had to build a sort of framework into using AI at the Trust. And what it involved was actually stopping once we knew we wanted to do this and partake on this journey, and actually taking a step back and saying, well, we need all the appropriate experts to be accessible and actually think about how the Trust is going to move forward with AI, because we don't want this to be a pet project. We want this to be scalable and with the potential of adoption at the end of whatever sort of service evaluation or research studies we do. So at this point, assembling the right team. And for this, in my own experience, the first thing to make this as easy as possible was to engage with the executive team. This had to be led. We are a particular NHS Trust where AI is actually ingrained into our 5-year strategy. So we know that the exec team is aligned because they know the potential of AI when it comes to delivering on patient outcomes, or in fact, patient and the staff sort of experience. So engaging the exec team, and by that I mean the chief executive, the medical director, and really the board, was the first step. It sounds like a jump, but if you engage them, they provide the resources, so you're not fighting a one-person battle to get all the different stakeholders. And also when the chief exec picks up the phone and tells IG, digital team, and everybody else to sort it out, they do. They're not going to listen to me. At any given point in time, everyone is stretched with the work that they're currently faced with. So it is very important to set this up, because this helps with the implementation, that you get everyone to the same table. Because I can give the sort of expertise when it comes to how we integrate it from a clinical workflow point of view, but getting in R&D to provide the guidance when it comes for all the further approvals we need, getting the information governance. That is the first step of getting the data side sorted, because we have an idea, but we don't know the processes in place. And the IG team come in where the directors know that the DPIA have to be filled out and what they're looking for. And I say IG team comes in, even when they do come in, it takes ages, because there's back and forth between the DPIA for the NHS Trust and for the companies, which you'd think would take a month, but it doesn't. It takes months and months. But we are getting better at it. We know where the sort of bottlenecks with the IG side is as well. And so the most important stakeholders for me, in order, was first engaging with R&D team, because in my mind, the way in an NHS Trust this goes forward is really to have a more of a research and innovation sort of department that takes forward AI together. So it does eventually, I think, sit under research, but with AI on the whole. So I engaged the R&D team, which knew that this was coming, because they also have already accessible people who are providing this expertise for more R&D related, not obviously the AI side of things, but there's so much overlap here. The information governance team, the digital team. People underestimate that actually, yes, you're thinking about IG, but the digital team come with the IT setup that is required. And there's a whole bunch of terms that they use with IP addresses and space in the cloud and this and that. Again, it is not my forte, but I know they're there. They have to connect the systems and make sure that they can talk and be within our firewall and be cloud first, because that's the way we want to go in the future. So the digital team has to be brought into that conversation from the word go as well, because they need time. At any given point, they're busy with the EPR that's being installed or the multiple projects that are happening right now as we go towards more of a structured digital sort of integration between our primary cares and secondary care. After that, it's we're unique in that we work very closely with our integrated care system. We know that the future in the long term is getting our sort of primary and secondary care data organized. So it was always good to have them sitting next to us, because it's good to know what different people are doing. Because what we didn't want to happen is that we're setting up one project and it's siloed off and everybody else is doing everything else. So bringing all the chief of services together to present to them, and it's easy to do that because chief of services have different leadership days within the trust, and you find that day and you go and tell them what you've set up. And bringing all of this together basically we brought together an AI working group to provide oversight on all AI sort of projects happening that were service evaluations and that were led by the R&D, so that everybody was sharing the same resources, and we were developing our own homegrown expertise because we were seeing more and more different projects, so we knew how to handle it. It wasn't throwing us off. And And alongside all of this, you need your contracts and legal team, because they will look at the contracts and you learn how the contracts gets done for R&D or for obviously service evaluations, and sort of balancing that act, because historically when I entered this, I found that NHS is almost going with a begging bowl saying, oh yes, we'd like to be part of this, but we're not. We are equal partners as far as I see it, because we are sitting there with the patient and we are going to buy the product. So wherever the directive comes from, individual trusts have to think about how they're going to pay, and then who is going to pay them for this sort of technology. And the focus is now shifting towards that, because all of these technologies have to be procured and taken to market in the future. So, and also getting a patient advocate. And again, I found that in reality, you'd want a patient sitting there, but no patient can cover all the different sorts of problems we're looking at in the different specialties. But having a sort of one hand, whether it's a charity that's working alongside the hospitals, or whether the different patient groups that are connected with the governor's board in the hospital, there is access to patient groups depending on which particular AI software you're looking at. So just making sure that you have all of this alongside getting clinicians on as well. But clinicians are really to do with if you're looking at a particular problem. And I find it quite interesting at this point, because with clinicians, you can't just involve every specialty, because some specialties just don't care. They're busy and they don't see the potential. And it's difficult at this early stage to engage the chaps who don't want to engage. But it's easy to engage when there are clinicians who know what the value is and they want to see it work. So it's easier for us to engage the clinicians who do see the scope of where AI can come in and solve problems for them and engage. So we just choose the path of least resistance and get the ones who want in and start using it early and be the early adopters within the different specialities. So this is the team. It sounds very simple, but getting this team into place so that there was governance around this team, they were feeding back to sort of whether you have a board of for a transformation board, or feeding back straight to the sort of leadership board, the senior leadership board. The governance will be made by whoever on the exec team leads the AI group. But I do think the future is that all NHS trusts will need to have some sort of AI working group if they intend to be within the sort of first phase of early adopters. And I'm sure people will follow in the next 2 to 3 years. But it is good to get a system, because at a most basic level, it gives you access to all the experts in one place when it comes to trying to implement AI technologies. So I will always focus on imaging again, picking a product. So as a radiologist, having that in-depth discussion with the decision makers who actually pay out for the products, which in my case is my chief of service. So sitting down and discussing where are the bottlenecks, because again, we looked at the different areas. Is it going to be x-rays all across the board? Actually, as a trust, we don't have an issue with extremities. Our radiographers will happily report it, and they're happy to report it. So we are not struggling with that, but chest x-ray was something we decided to look at. Now, generally, the imaging bottlenecks tend to be chest x-rays, breast cancer imaging, and intracranial imaging. So it helps that these are clinical priorities, so there are actually quite a lot of vendors in these areas. And one of the ways I've always found, and this is over a period of only 2 to 3 years, is there are a lot of vendors actually in all the spaces, whether you're looking at X-rays, CT, MRI, or all the different spaces, let alone body parts. Attending conferences gives us a chance to actually see some of these user interfaces that the companies show. It gives us a chance to actually meet with the national figureheads, whether it's people like Emma, people like Matt, and seeing the interagency collaborators come together to see where everyone, all the different companies that we're looking at. But actually, it actually comes down to quite simple, the basic principles of research. Do the literature reviews, because we need to follow the evidence. There is no company I know that doesn't say that their product is amazing. So we know that by standard, everyone's product is amazing. We just have to see the proof and show the prospective proof. So doing the literature review to see what that retrospective evidence is a good starting point. And as clinicians, we know how to critically appraise data. Most of us still just about remember looking at the numbers and seeing how it was done. And I'm not an expert in critically reviewing a paper, but I do know when I'm looking at numbers, how it fits into the narrative of whatever is being told to me. So it gives me confidence that I'm not just believing what people are saying, but actually reviewing the data. And historically, there is a lot of data on the validation on how companies do, but looking more towards prospectively, how do we actually get this and learn from prospectively putting it into real world practice? So I haven't given a list of names. It depends on the problems that you want to address, but there are lots of companies already present in pretty much any sector of imaging, whether you want to reduce your cardiac MRI scanning time by AI imaging recon, or you want certain things auto-reported based on their normal feature, or you want a second opinion. I know I'm deviating as I build trust and get my colleagues comfortable with the concept of AI tool helping with the workload. I'm choosing to focus more on its ability to triage and act as a quality assurance. I think we will get there to really using AI has been sold in imaging as pattern recognition. We will get there and we will use it, but we have to start somewhere to build in that trust from the word go. I'm very pro AI and I'm still cautious. The ones who don't trust it at all have to be maneuvered quite nicely so that they can see the potential of it before they start relying on it. Because at this point, the reliance is something that we have to grow towards. It's the journey. The next step is, and a lot of people don't seem to focus on this, the problem is one thing, but then actually defining when you think about implementing an AI technology, what is that criteria for success? And you need to think about the area where it will help and also show proof. So is it that you're going to actually save money? Is it because you're going to speed up that pathway? And if you are going to speed up, is it by a couple of days, which is not really that meaningful, or is it by a few weeks? Because if you tell me that certain cancers are picked up 4 weeks in advance, that is very meaningful in terms of the diagnostic pathway. So just thinking the criteria of success, and there may be a lot of metrics that we're not even thinking about that may be particular to that particular department in that trust because they have a problem, whether it's to do with this sort of efficiency of a pathway or they can't handle the workload. So as I mentioned, prioritization and quality assurance is where I see a lot of me and my colleagues going towards because it gives us that sort of help when it comes to normals and doesn't scare people that it's about to replace any clinician or not warrant a clinical opinion on a particular imaging set. It's obviously its role in accuracy and efficiency is also being realized. But just really thinking about that metric, knowing what actually means for it to succeed versus just doing a study to say, oh, well, yes, look, it sort of detected X, Y, and Z, but where did it? Because my chief of service will turn around to me and ask me, where is my saving? To buy anything in the NHS. So showing that metric that it has the potential to either reduce time for a clinician by taking away part of the workload, a safe part of the workload, so they can be directed to more urgent patient-facing things, could be one of the things. It could be as easy as saving money because you're diverting it from somewhere else, or getting the entire pathway slightly more efficient because, again, whether it's manpower or money or the patient experience or patient outcomes, there has to be some thought into what the end goal will be. So it always falls down to life saved, time saved, or money saved, but you have to think about it. The next thing is run a pilot. So service evaluations is what we've chosen to focus in on as our starting point, only because the R&D studies we do, we're finding it takes time. It takes, and it requires doing, but we want to run service evaluations because we're interested in a product. We think it has real scope. So it's about setting up a particular pathway safely by assembling the right team, thinking about the problem, thinking about the metrics for success, and then run that pilot. Because without testing how an actual AI software is going to plug in, actually implement with our current IT system, our PACS or EPR system, we're not going to know anybody. Everyone is just speculating all the time until you actually run a pilot. Whether you run it in stealth mode or for a defined period of time, you have to do something to work out where all the barriers are going to be. So testing the product in your clinical workflow is a good starting point. And running it over a burst of whether you do it of 1,000 patients, whether you decide to do it over a 3-4 week, just to get the feel of how it's going to enter the system, what are the resources that are going to be required to be in place, because it's just not there right now, and getting the feedback from the clinicians. And a good way to do it is to get it how it is, as you're setting up when you're doing it, and obviously at the end we will collect that feedback, because the perception and the usability for the clinicians, who are the people who are going to use it, no matter what the outcome, is very important. They have to feel that it doesn't add another 3 clicks on their existing workflow, because they're not going to accept it. And then judge by the success metrics that you wanted to measure, and you only have to decide after thorough evaluation. So it's I've approached it from a very unique perspective of how we're set up in the NHS, and that you have to feel comfortable and make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and safely. It really helps now that we do have documentation from the AI labs, and we've got all NICE and the multi-agency partners coming in to provide that oversight on what needs to be in place, which gives us a lot more confidence when we're doing pilot schemes within the NHS. And you have to publish. It is no point doing it if the learning cannot be disseminated. I always find it odd that things happen, but no one has presented it. If only to present it so that if you have learned that it doesn't work, you can teach other NHS trusts this is how not to do it. Because even if I fail in this pilot, the learnings will be there that let's try a different way because this didn't work, or the resources that you definitely need to have in place. But you do need to disseminate in forums such as these, so that there is learning all across. So it's a very short and sweet way of how to think about implementing in the NHS. The main thing is to take lead and do it, because it does need to come into the patient-facing ground level, and clinicians do need to take lead on it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and comprehensive. So I'll move swiftly on now to our next speaker, Garry Pettet, who's going to be talking about his experience from Medica, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Hello, everybody. Privileged to be able to talk to you guys in person, as has been said before. My name's Garry Pettet. I'm a consultant radiologist and a software engineer, and I work for Medica. My role at Medica is partly as a reporting radiologist. I'm also the clinical lead for audit, so I do a lot of audit and appraisal work, and I sit on their board of what we call Future Tech, which is our forward-thinking sort of innovation internal sort of platform for developing new software and bringing it to our clients. So just a little bit about Medica and our background, so I can give you some context. We're the UK's largest teleradiology provider, and we do an absolute boatload of studies every year. So by many metrics, we're the largest radiology department in the UK. We do about 1.5 million studies per annum that's growing. We're also expanding into other markets across the world. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about, well, mostly about brain CT, so it's important to give some context as well. We report about 160,000 out of hours brain CTs every year, so loads and loads of brain CTs. And we employ, through one means or another, about 500 radiologists, mostly based in the UK. A lot of them are contracted, some employed, but we also have a presence throughout Europe, Australia, and the States. So I was asked to talk about sort of something very similar that we just heard about from Dr. Kumar. How do you choose the right tool? And I'm going to give it as a perspective from a private enterprise, really, because I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from what we've learned and how we've deployed the algorithms that we use. You need to, if you're going to make a decision that you want to use AI, you've got to ask the right question. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Okay, we're all pretty familiar with artificial intelligence here and its current state. We're miles and miles away from artificial general intelligence, and we know that AI is extremely good at answering narrow questions, okay? So you need to distill the clinical problem that you want solved down into, ideally, a binary yes or no, or at least a very small problem space. That's really going to get maximum value out of AI. And so we asked ourselves, okay, well, look, we want to use some AI tools in our workflow, okay? We don't at the moment. It's really important. Everyone is talking about how we can get productivity gains. What are we going to do? So we thought, well, the biggest impact we're likely to have is in our out-of-hours work, because a huge volume of our work is there. Not only is it incredibly important for patient outcome and safety. It's a big money winner for us. So, this is an area we're going to focus on. And we do an enormous amount of brain CTs. So we thought, well, what on a brain scan is going to help us to deliver increased productivity and increased safety? Well, we realised that, brain scans mostly are normal. So, can we have a tool that tells us if the scan is normal or abnormal? Yes, these tools exist. So let's focus in, okay, can we find a tool that's going to tell us if there's something really critical on this scan? Because if we can, then what that's going to enable us to do is to dispatch that scan to a reporter ASAP. Okay, we need to move away, or we certainly are trying to move away in our company, and I think radiology departments in general have to move away from the first in, first out sort of mantra of reporting. Okay, it's the important stuff that has to get done, and the less important stuff, I'm afraid, has to wait. And that's just the way it is because of workforce demands, and we have to be pragmatic about it. So we're like, okay, how can we prioritize the really dangerous scans? Okay, these are the ones that are going to have the greatest impact. And so we decided to focus on intracranial hemorrhage, okay, because we could have picked any one of a number of things, but we wanted to have a defined outcome, as was just talked about by Dr. Kumar, intracranial hemorrhage. It's a catastrophic occurrence. Something can be done about it sometimes if it's found early, and the clinicians will want to know about it. So once we'd identified the problem space, how do we get a tool? How are we going to pick what tool is going to find intracranial hemorrhage on a brain scan? Well, unfortunately, there's not really a sort of central place you can go to and find every single AI algorithm out there, because new ones are being developed all the time. It's a really dynamic space, and you can Google it, you can read papers, and all of these are things you have to do when you're picking a tool. But us as a company, we used a few sort of tools that we found. One of them was this FDA approval sort of website from the American College of Radiologists. It was really nice. It's a simple website. Basically, it just lists all the FDA approved algorithms, and you can filter by body part, modality, how long it's been accredited for, etc. And at least narrow down your list. Okay, here's 5 tools that are going to detect what I'm looking for that are FDA approved. And there's a counterpart for CE mark in Europe, which is, again, the consortium don't manage this centrally, so we have to rely on independent people. And fortunately, Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands, they have a website which does just this. Again, I can say, show me all the AI tools which work on CT heads, and then it will gives me a list, and I can click through to their websites, and I can read their data sheets, and I can start doing my own research around that, look at the papers that they published, etc. The third thing you can do is talk to a PACS vendor. Now, we didn't have this opportunity at Medica initially because we've just transitioned to a new PACS system. We've just moved to Sectra, and they actually offer a marketplace for AI. And this is a growing thing that PACS vendors are doing. So you can go to them and say, look, which tools do you have that can prioritize workflow for heads CTs? And you might find that some of them, they've got 2 or 3 that you can use. And the advantage of that is that, well, you don't have to worry too much about the integration because your PACS vendor will do it for you for a fee, obviously. But the downside to that is there's going to be limited choice. These are a curated, bespoke list of companies that they've chosen to work with. So you have to factor that in. Also, there's less scope for price negotiation, which for us as a private company, and I think NHS as well, we have to be cost mindful. You're not dealing with individual companies, so you're pretty much beholden to what the PACS vendor is going to charge you or license this for. When you've picked a tool, we had a series of questions that the tool had to fulfill before we were going to go ahead. So probably the most important thing for us were these 2 questions, really. Did the company publish peer-reviewed data? Okay. Now, more and more this is becoming commonplace. Okay, I think the AI vendors are savvy to this, that actually we're cautious. This is a sort of nascent new era, and we want to see proof before we use any of these tools. We were always going to validate the tool that we chose, and I think Hugh is going to talk a little bit about this afterwards, so I won't encroach too much upon it. But you have to validate it yourself. But I want to see has your data been published and scrutinized independently of you? Because, as has been said before, every vendor is going to say their tool is great. Why wouldn't they? And importantly, are they transparent about their training data? In the early days of AI startups, anyone could build an AI model and an image classifier from 500 chest X-rays pulled off of GitHub and just say, here's my algorithm. Is this accurate? if they're not transparent about where the data came from, how much data they used, who labelled it, how they labelled it, what their demographics are, then we weren't interested. Okay, so for us, we wanted absolute transparency. Okay, if I have to drill through 500 different sublinks in your website to find some small print that tells me something, I'm not interested. Okay, so when we were looking, it had to be first and foremost for us, and I would strongly encourage that to people. I think that shows a good sign that the company is confident in the data that they've got and the accuracy of their tool, and if they've got nothing to hide, they'll share it. And there are many great AI vendors like Qure, who we have partnered with, who do just that. Second, the next few things are, okay, we pick our tool, how are we going to integrate in our workflow? At Medica, we have a very complicated workflow with many bespoke systems behind the scenes. And we had a lot of anxiety about how is this actually going to fit in to, how are we going to engineer it? We have finite resources to do the software engineering ourselves. What are the options for integration? Most AI vendors are going to, push cloud-based stuff. They'll host your data. They'll set up a private instance in your own data center. You can have on-premises stuff where you can run servers locally if you're extremely cautious about sharing your data. But it's important that you have options. And it's also important that the company is responsive. Are they willing to modify their tool? Okay, because they're after your business ultimately, really. And you have to remember this. I think sometimes you can feel, particularly if you're a clinician and you're not used to negotiating with these companies, that you can feel pressured to sort of take something you're not happy with. And actually, you're the one who's holding the purse strings, and you're the one who is going to grow their business. So it's really important that you take ownership of this up front, and you make sure that the company is willing to work with you. For us, it's really important to make sure they had the desired accreditations. Now, you have to have CE marking in Europe to sell a medical device, but bear in mind, just if you see a CE mark on a tool doesn't mean it's deeply validated. About a third of the Class 1 medical devices, of which about a third of AI algorithms cite themselves can be self-certified. Okay, so just seeing the mark doesn't just mean, oh, okay, someone said this is all cool. Okay, just due diligence is really important. And obviously FDA approval we wanted because we're a global group, and if we want to deploy these algorithms in other countries, that was important for us. So we had to make sure a tool had these two things. Talked about is the team contactable and responsive. So bear in mind that not every AI startup or every AI vendor is based in the UK. Many aren't. I mean, we have a thriving AI scene here, which is great. But I mean, Qure is based in India, for example. Many others are based in other countries. So we have to bear that in mind when it comes to how will I have discussions with them. It's been helped by the pandemic has helped in some respects. We're all familiar with Teams, etc. But bear in mind time zones and things like this. So that you have to keep that in the back of your mind. Leading on from that, do they understand UK healthcare? Okay, if they're not based in the UK, then it might be totally alien, the concept of the NHS and how we do things. And I appreciate the irony being a private company talking about it, but it's true. The NHS is quite unique. So are they aware of that? And are they willing to learn if they're not? And that's really important. And you can sound these things out in a meeting or two with these companies. And don't be afraid to have meetings and sit downs with no obligation. Okay, I mean, it's incumbent on you to do that. And finally, I'm preaching to the choir here, NHS clinicians, but is it affordable? I mean, that for us was, we're trying to turn a profit, we're trying to do it safely, we're trying to do it accurately, but also we have to make money, and so we have to make sure that we can afford to use the tool. Now, that's a really whistle-stop explanation of how we picked our tool, and I think there's going to be some questions and answers at the end, and I'm very happy to answer questions on how we decided to implement it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. So we have managed to find the slides, so I will hand over to Hugh to do his presentation.
Thank you, Emma. I've got the unenviable position of coming after three excellent speakers who've slightly encroached on my content, and also trying to get you through to lunch. I'm going to try to give you some mind-blowing nuggets of information, so do pay attention, please, and we can carry on the questions afterwards. I'm Dr. Hugh Harvey. So both Amrita and Garry have touched on some of the things, the sensible common sense ideas of how to buy AI. I'm only here to say that I helped co-author a paper which includes as many of the points that they've already mentioned. It's called the Eclair Guidelines. I might have had something to do with the naming of it, being half Belgian and loving eclairs. but it's an open source paper written with a community of academics and industry members from across Europe. As Garry said, there is no real central database to look for AI solutions. One is coming. It is called EUDAMED. It's a new regulatory database. And from next year, it should be mandatory for all medical device manufacturers, Class 2A and above, to register on EUDAMED and do so on an annual basis. The amount of information that will be available on EUDAMED varies on the class of device. Class 3 devices will have to put all of their clinical trial data publicly available online. Class 2 will not. You may be wondering why. Blame the lobbyists. But that will be online very soon. It already is online, and I think agents have already registered. That's correct, isn't it, Lloyd? So you can go and check out some information on companies there. Already mentioned the one from Radboud. This is excellent, produced by Kiki van Leeuwen. I hope I pronounced that correctly. An excellent resource. There is the FDA database. There's several of them. You can look up the 510K clearance database, which are companies who've said, I'm exactly the same as someone else, so I'm going to get regulatory approval. There's the De Novo database for breakthrough devices, the PMA database, and the most interesting one that no one knows about, and this is your first mind-blowing nugget of information, is the MAUDE database, which is the ones where there have been reported adverse events and errors. Do check that. There is an increasing amount of AI-reported adverse events and errors. And then there's the one from the Data Science Institute of the ACR, which Garry also mentioned. Again, be warned, these are FDA cleared, or not necessarily FDA cleared, but they are all American-based ones. They might not have approval for Europe, or from the 1st of January 2023, the UK CE mark. So the CE mark may not just be the only thing you're looking for NHS. So what do the ECLAIR guidelines cover? These are all common sense things, and Amrita and Garry have touched on many of these already. The ECLAIR guidelines essentially we've just basically formalized it into some 10-point simple strategy that even I can understand. So the first thing is obviously, as Amrita and Garry said, is think about what you actually need AI to do. Don't go and buy AI because it's AI. You have to have a problem to solve, and it might be that, luckily, AI is the right way to solve that problem. Once you've identified that problem, you need to make sure that the intended use, and this is a regulatory term, of that CE cleared or FDA cleared algorithm matches your problem. And always ask to read the intended use statement of the vendor, because what they'll say in their marketing, in their nice glossy brochure, will be put in the best possible flowery terms. But what you want to know is, what did you get regulatory approval to do? So always go back to the intended use. And there's two documents. There's an intended use statement, and there's something called IFU, which is instructions for use. And there you'll be able to answer these questions. What does it do? Who are the end users? How does it do it? Where is it supposed to be used? And why? Okay, so these questions can be answered in those two documents. The intended use is a legal part of the FDA and the CE marking frameworks, and what they say in their intended use needs to be matched in their labeling, advertising, oral, written statements, and they are not allowed to knowingly offer their device for use outside of their intended use. So you can catch some companies out because they might be saying slightly different things to what they actually got regulatory clearance for. Think about it like a drug. You wouldn't want someone to develop a drug and have it regulatory approved for one disease and then try and sell it to you to cure another disease. That's illegal, and it's the same with AI. Benefits and risks. I'm not going to read this slide. I'm not a fan of people who read slides. You are all intelligent adults who can read. What I'm going to say is, if you want to know what the benefits and risks are of a particular AI device from a particular vendor, there is a useful regulatory document called their Benefit Risk Analysis Matrix, and you can ask to see that. It is not publicly available on EUDAMED or on the FDA databases, but a vendor will have one, and if they don't, then they shouldn't have got regulatory clearance. So you can ask to see their BRA, and you can go through it with them, and you might actually be able to talk through them some extra benefits and risks that they hadn't thought of, and then the next time they can update the matrix themselves. The third most important thing, obviously, is performance and validation. I wouldn't try and get too clever and data sciencey unless you are a very clever data sciencey person. Trust in peer-reviewed literature, if that company has produced it. Trust in what they are saying to you if it matches what the peer-reviewed literature says. But as Amrita says, do your own research as well. One thing that is growing in importance and awareness is point 3 here, which is about hidden stratifications within data. And often you don't find biases or errors in algorithms until you run it in your own data and you actually look at some sub-stratifications within that data that perhaps the vendor did not appreciate before. Not all stratifications are really obvious from the first go. So talking about sub-stratifications with a vendor is very important. And a good vendor will say, hands up, okay, fine, yes, let's investigate that with you, rather than just claim everything will be fine if they don't know it already. Check that the performance metrics that they are talking about actually are relevant to the relevant task. So everyone talks about AUC and ROC curves. That's not the only way to measure the performance of an AI device, depending on the task. The vast majority of radiology AI systems that are out there are classifiers, so it makes sense to look at AUC. But you must include the confidence intervals as well. Often people say, I've got an AUC of 90%. Great. What's the confidence interval? Oh, it's between 50 and 90%. Completely different, right? So you have to talk about confidence intervals. If you're thinking about maybe a segmentation tool, something from radiotherapy delineation, AUC is the wrong metric. If you're talking about specific detection, i.e. pointing to a lesion on an image, you can look for free recall ROC curves and always ask about the false positive rates on those as well. So there's different metrics you can ask about, so do check those. As Garry also mentioned, usability and integration is also very important. The great thing is that there is an international standard for usability, 62366, and again, if they have regulatory clearance, they should have some documentation to show how they intend to be usable and integrate with people's workflows. But these are the general questions, as laid out in the ECLAIR guidance, that you can ask these vendors. So my last bit I'm going to talk about is the financial side of it. This is kind of the murky, grey, hazy side of AI. Nobody knows how much to pay, how much it costs, or how much it will save. That is becoming clearer, but only with time. Here in the UK, NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, has or is producing an evidence standards framework for AI devices. And 50% of the guidance in that evidence standards framework talks about health economics outcomes research, or HEOR. So if a company wants to apply to NICE to get a NICE approval or a thumbs up, basically to say, we do recommend this technology for the NHS, wouldn't that be wonderful for all the AI vendors here to get that? They will only do so if you have the key economic information done under an appropriate economic analysis. Now, there are different ways to do different types of economic analysis, and there is a public consultation by NICE, I think starting this month, to talk about what the public would prefer to see. But in essence, it's kind of the same as what Big Pharma have been doing for decades, is trying to figure out quality of life, adjusted years, and the potential financial benefit over the lifetime of a patient. Now, that's not always appropriate for AI devices, which are maybe just trying to deal with something super critical that just doesn't impact the patient's whole life. So you can do something smaller called a budget impact model, and this diagram sort of shows the different things that NICE are considering accepting as evidence. So budget impact modelling, or BIMs, I think is going to become something of a new necessity, especially if people are going to be applying for NICE. The great thing about these models is that they're quite quick and easy to develop. You can do it probably with existing clinical trial data that you already have, and you can publish them. So you can get these models peer-reviewed and published. And I do predict that over the next few years, we're going to start to see sort of robust, standardized models for how much a chest X-ray AI could potentially save a trust, or potentially what the price point might be. And so these things will grow in awareness in our AI community. So those are the kind of mind-blowing nuggets that I hope that you can take into the lunch break. I have been Hugh. Thank you very much.
Were there any questions that people wanted to pose to the speakers?
Do you want me to use the microphone?
Yes, please, because I think we're recording. So, and if you could just introduce yourself and where you're from before you ask a question, that would be great.
Hello. I don't know if this is on. No.
Okay, well, maybe just speak loudly.
Oh, well. I'm Matt, I'm a guest project in Southampton, involved in data science and just an R&D. So, thank you all for your talk, so amazing, fantastic stuff. The best I want to know about the business models, so that you answered that question at the end about affordability. What do you think the kind of future business models for these types of algorithms should be? Is it a kind of SaaS type model, or where do you think this is all heading?
Great, and maybe we can have a response from Dr. Pettet.
Hi. Some of this is protected information. Obviously, like it's deal brokering and things like that. I can't speak to specifics, but I think it's still being developed. And I think having talked around the floor by the plenary this morning, I think the vendors are still figuring out themselves. It probably doesn't scale to charge per scan, say for instance, because you will reach a threshold where that becomes too expensive. So the bottom line is, I think at the moment you'll speak to many different vendors and get many different answers, and there's no one size fits all at the moment. I don't know what the answer is. From a personal point of view, we do charge per item. So from our point of view, I guess we would pay a small fraction per item to use AI. I don't know how well that's scaled in an NHS system.
So we have now come up to the lunch break. So I think we can maybe have one question, and then I'll release you to go and get your lunch, and/or come up to speak to the individual speakers. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi there, Mathew, CD, Radiology, BHIT, AI work group lead. Just a quick thing, because as Hugh's saying that AI should be treated more like drugs, you see a lot of the research, it's AI versus expert groups. Well, an example that's happened recently is that got a message from the ICS saying that they were about to invest a lot of money in a chest X-ray AI, and I was like, you did what? And one company, and there are multiple other companies. And has there been any work on head-to-head? Because you don't do a drug against a placebo, you do a drug against the best available drug. So there's multiple chest X-ray vendors. They all are magnificent. They all are disruptors, aren't they? Hate that word. But yeah, it's like NFTs and Bitcoin. But this is the thing. So what we are going to end up doing is do sort of like a traditional product, presentation, which seems a bit weak. They all come with the same evidence, won't they? But I'm just wondering if there's any work being done on comparing AI of a certain group against each other, like a head injury against, like a bleed against bleed, a chest X-ray against chest X-ray, anything like that, because that's actually what you really want to know, because the market's now getting full of valid stuff. You don't know if it's one's better than the other, or are they all the same?
Yep.
Yeah, is this working?
Yes.
It is working. Can you hear me now? It's a really good question. So, there's two sides to the argument about head-to-head. Let's do it from the NHS patient purchaser perspective. Yes, we all want to see head-to-heads. We want to know which AI is the best, which one should we use, right? Now think about it from the industry side of it. Do you want your algorithm to be compared in a potential winner-takes-all situation? So there's two sides to the coin. I'm not going to say which one is better. I think there are merits and cons to both. Have head-to-head investigations taken place? Yes. And in fact, there's vendors in this room who've taken place. I think Qure, a very good example, they went head-to-head on several of their products. I think with TB for chest X-ray and a couple of others I can't remember off the top of my head. There are some great head-to-heads. Have we done head-to-head things in the UK? There was one for COVID chest X-ray. We're not allowed to know the results. Now, I assume there's some pressure from industry not to release them just yet. The second part that I want to answer is we are early in the adoption curve. Probably too early to demand head-to-heads prior to purchasing or prior to testing these things. I think we need a period of a few years to get these deployed and tested individually before we start to try to do these kind of meta-analyses and big competitive trials. I hope that's been quite concise. Okay.
Thank you for that. And maybe just one thing to note. Sorry, I'm conscious that we need to release you for lunch. Which comes back to something that Dr. Kumar said. So it's really important that when trusts do implement these technologies, when they make decisions to go all for nothing for one technology, that they do publish their experience of using those technologies, because we know that the context in which the technologies are deployed is so important for the outcomes that you actually see. So, so just a plug to all of the people who are from hospitals who are looking to buy and deploy these things. Please do share your learnings about your experiences of deploying them. So thank you so much to all of the speakers, and thank you so much for listening.